Okay, so again, welcome. This is the sixth class in this series called Mastering the Mind, where we're looking at the two chapters of Master Shantideva's text, the chapter 4, which is all about kind of how we have this conscientiousness in our practice. And we finished that the last week. And then tonight we continue chapter 5, which is all about this guarding alertness, introspection. We'll go into that a little bit more tonight. So let me go ahead and pull up the prayers that we're going to recite before class that we um, uh, have here. Let me see, where is it? So there they are. Okay, get them up on the screen here. There's this wonderful praise to Shakyamuni Buddha that we're going to recite 3 times in English. To the founder, the endowed destroyer, the one gone beyond, foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of God and human beings, to you, the complete and fully awakened one, thou transcendent destroyer, the glorious, the subduer from the Shakya clan. I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. And we'll do the short mandala offering, again, visualizing the phenomenal world totally transformed into a beautiful pure land, a Buddha paradise, however you want to visualize that, but free of all the defects and faults that we see in our world, free of illness, free of any contagion, all of these things that we're experiencing in the world right now. This beautiful future Buddha paradise that we're trying to create for ourselves as well as for all sentient beings to be able to have that in their lives. So we're making this vast pure offering to the merit field, to the Buddha, all of our gurus, all the holy beings, so that we can receive their blessings and actualize these wonderful teachings from Master Shantideva as soon as possible so we can help other beings to do the same. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. And then finally, refuge and bodhicitta, this verse that encapsulates these 2 ideas. The first, refuge, finding that heartfelt, safe direction in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, especially the Dharma at this time when the Dharma is our real refuge, to practice working with our minds in the midst of everything that is going on in this world. And then certainly the last 2 lines, and we'll meditate on bodhicitta shortly, but initially just at least bring that idea to mind, the thought of being here, engaging in these teachings for the welfare of all beings, so you can become enlightened to help every one of them. We'll do this once in English, twice in the Tibetan. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chunyen gi pe sunam gi Dola penshir sangye drupar shog. Sangye chodang soki choknam la. Jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi. Daki chunyen gi pe sanam gi. Dola penshir sangye drupar shog. Okay, let's go ahead and do a short meditation before we begin tonight. So just find a good meditation posture, making sure the back is somewhat upright and straight. And then within this uprightness of the body, try to relax as best as you can, letting go of tension where you see it in the body to the best of your ability. And then begin to attend to the breath. And if you have a technique that you already use with the breath, by all means, you're welcome to do that for the next few minutes. If you need a suggestion, again, I generally encourage people to work with the point at the tip of the nose, where we feel the sensation of the air coming in and out of the nostrils as we inhale and exhale. And whatever method of working with the breath, we want to keep our focus on the breath and try not to let the mind get distracted. But when it does get distracted, there's no judgment called for at that time. We simply let go of whatever it was that distracted us and gently return to the breath. So I'll ring the bowl here to start the meditation period. We'll do a few minutes in silence, and then I'll lead you in a short reflection to strengthen this motivation of bodhicitta for tonight. So now let's take an opportunity to set our motivation for tonight. And when we look at the world right now and all that's happening, we can see how important it is that we dedicate our lives to benefiting others, because we can see how difficult samsara can get even in this human realm. The Buddha teaches a variety of existences, many of which have much greater suffering than what we're experiencing in this realm right now. But in this human realm, there are many faults, many defects. We're seeing, certainly in the world, evidence of that. So certainly there is a possibility of just generating a motivation that is still quite self-concerned within what we're witnessing. We can look at this world and see that we ourselves would like to escape from dukkha, from this dissatisfaction that we are experiencing that manifests in these various ways, especially as the more painful experiences within life. And that's the first level of motivation that we could set for tonight, is to at least want that for ourselves. And there's nothing wrong with that initial thought, as long as we don't stop there. To want you yourself to be free from all of this is a noble, very virtuous state of mind. And as I said, we don't want to stop there. We want to recognize that as we open our eyes to the suffering of the beings in this world and the suffering of all the realms of existence that the Buddha taught, that it would be very short-sighted and quite selfish of us to simply dedicate this time to our own welfare. And in that vein, we generate the mind of bodhicitta that is embracing the welfare of all beings, with those two main thoughts. First, the wish that we could actually become the cause to help all beings to be free from their suffering and to attain their deepest potential, to bring them to the fulfillment of their aspiration to be happy, to be free from suffering. And then secondly, the recognition that to accomplish that fully, we have to follow the Bodhisattva path. We have to engage in the Bodhisattva deeds. And so we're studying this text so that we can be more in line with that type of behavior, motivated by this desire to benefit all beings, so that we can eventually attain our own enlightenment and then help all other beings to do the same. So this is the perfect motivation to generate during these difficult times. It's the best way to be of the greatest use to all beings. Not that we shouldn't do other things in the moment to benefit more temporarily, but that we recognize that we're in it for the long haul. We're in it to make sure that we are able to benefit all sentient beings through having developed our own capability. Through becoming a Buddha, we will then have everything it takes to be able to lead sentient beings, not just out of the temporary suffering that they're experiencing, but out of all suffering and into the state of enlightenment as well. So generate that mind now and hold that mind very deeply in your heart for these teachings tonight, so that everything we do becomes a cause for the welfare of all, without exception. Okay, again, thank you for joining tonight. And I'm really glad we have these opportunities to connect with each other. So it's wonderful to see you all here tonight engaging in these teachings. So what we're going to do again is to continue. Actually, we didn't really quite get into the full chapter. Recall that in chapter 5, we started off, and I'll go ahead and pull up the slides for that. We started off with two main outlines that the text is divided into, at least this chapter. The whole topic of this is explaining the way of training in morality, which is one of the 6 perfections. It's the second perfection, or paramita, by relating it to these two minds, the introspection and mindfulness. Of course, it goes on beyond that. The ... is, these are the methods for keeping virtuous dharmas pure. So but through introspection and mindfulness, we can keep our virtuous states of mind, what we're engaging in, very pure. We can maintain that virtuous behavior. So there was a general presentation went through last week, and there were no associated with that. The verses for this from Master Shantideva fit into the second outline, the individual presentation, which we'll get into tonight. So as part of that introduction, I'm just going to show a few slides just to get us back into the topic. There was a whole introduction to the 6 perfections, these paramitas, and we're going to go into talk about those a little bit, even in the beginning of this chapter, and some of the verses that talk about how each of these are completed, perfected within our own minds. And if we look at them on the screen here, we see that they are all knowers or minds or intentions. They're states of mind that we're trying to generate. And just recall again that generosity doesn't have its own chapter in Master Shantideva's text. It's indicated kind of briefly in a few places, but especially the 10th chapter is pointed to as the expiration of the mind of generosity by giving away all of our merits. It's the dedication chapter at the very end of this text. Ethics or morality is what we're going to be talking about in this chapter, chapter 5. Chapter 6 deals with patience, 7 with joyous effort, 8 with concentration, and the 9th chapter with wisdom. And hopefully we'll have the good fortune to continue to go through this text and to be able to complete all of these. But at this point, since we are moving away from the bodhicitta chapters and the conscientiousness, it helps us to maintain our bodhicitta and move away from the afflictions and so on. All of that was covered in the first 4 chapters. Now we're actually getting into a more detailed investigation of each of these perfections, these practices of a bodhisattva. So those 2 factors that were mentioned in the title of mindfulness and introspection, Drampa and Shejin, these are talked about, and I'm just going to share just a couple of screens. I'm not going to go through everything I did last time, but Jeffrey Hopkins in Meditation on Emptiness describes mindfulness as a non-forgetfulness with respect to a familiar phenomenon. It has the function of causing non-distraction. So essentially, mindfulness is non-forgetfulness. Again, we use mindfulness in a lot of different contexts in different Buddhist traditions. There's a lot of emphasis on the practice of mindfulness, which is this kind of unconditional presence with everything that is going on in our minds. Here, the idea is mindfulness has that quality of being present with what's going on, but it's in regard to non-forgetfulness, meaning that we are not going to forget how we want to live our lives, how we want to respond to others, how we want to react to things that go on. So this is where we maintain this virtue through having a mindfulness of needing to uphold that at all times, so we don't forget that. And then we also don't forget that we want to avoid non-virtue, that we want to not engage in unwholesome behavior, immoral behavior, if you will. And so this is, again, with respect to a familiar phenomenon. We have to become familiar with it. That's why mindfulness is also taught generally in the context of meditation, because it's in meditation that we become familiar with things. Then we also increase that familiarity when we're off the cushion, when we're actually going about our day. It has the function of causing non-distraction, meaning that we don't get distracted and engage in unskillful behavior. In this context in particular, where we're looking at mindfulness with regard to our behavior, our ethics, it keeps us on the straight and narrow, keeps us moving forward, because if we recall that if we have that non-forgetfulness, we will stay on that path of virtue. So in terms of introspection, this other factor, Shejin, this has a nature of wisdom. It's not really identified as a separate mental factor within the 51 mental factors that are taught in the Buddhist psychology texts of Lorik. Lorik usually defined as minds and awarenesses. Anyway, this idea of introspection, it has a nature of wisdom. It's kind of included within that mental factor. And introspection is like a spy that's sort of in the corner of our minds. And it analyzes the mind to see whether laxity or excitement has arisen. This is especially within the context of our meditation. It's that factor of our mind that checks in occasionally, just like I was saying in the giving the instruction for the meditation tonight. You set your object and your attention to have mindfulness of the breath, but then the mind will occasionally wander. Well, then when you check in, that's the mind of introspection that's kind of analyzing to see what's going on and what's the quality of our meditation is. And of course, if the mind has gotten very lax, kind of dull, dark, and again to sort of recede, then we want to correct that by heightened awareness. If it's gotten very excited and kind of moving out to all these other things that are much more entertaining to think about than to watch the breath, then we want to pull the mind back in. And so introspection is included as an antidote to help us to identify what's going on in the mind. And we'll talk about this just briefly with the final slide that's an introductory slide tonight before we get into the verses. Then there was this nice little description that comes actually, Dave. I located the verse. I didn't have it on the screen last time. It's the 108th verse, almost the end of the text. I mean, in terms of this chapter, we have 109 verses in chapter 5. So in that, this is a paraphrase of that. It says, in brief, this alone is the definition of introspection, the repeated examination of the state of one's body and mind. So introspection is also used. Again, we talk about it in meditation because in meditation we have that mindfulness that is focused on the breath at the nose or wherever it is that we're working with the breath and tries to maintain that awareness of the breath, to not move away from it. But introspection is used as a tool to help us to be sure that we are doing that. But during our day, when we're up off the cushion, we need both factors as well. And we need to be aware of kind of how I want to live my life, to engage in bodhisattva behavior, to have good intention with everything that I do, to do all my actions with bodhicitta motivation and so on. But then we also need this factor of introspection that's checking in to see, well, what's the quality of my mind right now? Is my mind degenerating to, more diluted thoughts, wasting time doing other things, or am I actually making good use of every moment of my day? So we need those factors, to help us throughout our day. It's not just that they're important in meditation, though obviously that's where they are taught generally and where we do see the ramifications of them in terms of our ability to calm the mind, to focus the mind. So there's a little description that I actually took from, this was the title of this book. I think it's on your book list with another title, something like, I can't remember what it is. But The Way of Awakening was how it was originally published quite some years ago, maybe beginning of the 2000s, 2005, 6, something like that, maybe. Geshe Yeshe Topten says these two mental factors, discriminating alertness, which is the translation term they used in that text for inspection, and mindfulness, are extremely important in disciplining the mind. Discriminating alertness is the mental factor that is able to judge what the mind is doing at any given moment. Again, this is how it's demonstrated in terms of our day. It's that alertness that is checking in to kind of say, what's going on? Are you doing what you need to be doing? Mindfulness is the factor that keeps this observation constant. So it's, again, introspection, checking in to see the quality of our mindfulness. If our mindfulness is there and present, then we are observing the mind all the time. We're knowing what's going on. We know when deluded thoughts, anger, desire, and so on begin to arise, and we're able to overcome them. We're able to, do what we can to move in the opposite direction. If we've got our mindfulness, we're fine. But introspection is there because our mindfulness is not always going to be present. It's going to have lapses in it because this is the nature of our minds, as long as we don't have a deeper concentration that we can bring into our daily lives. So while driving, he uses the example, we must be conscious of speed, of the other driver's behavior, of the road, and generally keep an eye on everything, right? So you need mindfulness to drive really well. You have to be conscious of all these things, what's all going on. That's kind of our observation of what's happening in the moment. So in the same way, if we want to, we must be conscious of it moment by moment. And if it has positive intentions, we must praise ourselves. Whereas if it has negative intentions, we must stop and refrain from translating them into action. Of course, physical and verbal action, definitely we want to stop. But even the mental action that's going on, the thoughts that might keep ruminating in our minds, we want to do the best we can to stop those as well. So again, these two factors play a job in that. Just like when you are driving, you'll have that mindfulness that is staying present with what's going on, that's paying attention to the traffic around you and what the speed that you're going and what have you. But then you might lapse for a moment. Maybe you've got music playing and suddenly you're singing along with the music and you're not maybe paying as much attention. Well, you need your introspection to go, hey, are you mindful of what you're doing? You're driving right now. You need to pay more attention to driving. And so in the same way, these two factors are guides during our day to help us to stay on track with what we want to do. So this was the slide that I hadn't shown last time, the one final slide before we get into the text that has to do with how mindfulness and introspection are presented in terms of the antidotes. That was mentioned in the earlier slide, that introspection is part of the antidotes. I'm not going to go into this in great detail because this is actually something that we'll touch on when we get to the 8th chapter on the perfection of concentration. But know that in this technique to develop what is called calm abiding, shine, many of you know this term. It's a state of mind where the mind becomes very serviceable and is able to abide on whatever virtuous object we choose for as long as we wish. It's a mind that is necessary on our path in order to take our realizations deeper. So there are 5 faults that we have along the way in developing this mind. The first is laziness, and laziness can manifest in a variety of ways, but it's essentially, in this context, keeping us from getting on the cushion and doing the work that we need to do to heighten the concentrated mind, the meditative stabilization that we want to develop. The 4 antidotes to that are faith, this conviction in the teachings on calm abiding and the ability to attain that state, an aspiration to move in that direction, the effort or exertion that we need to accomplish that, and then the pliancy that we finally are able to achieve over time that will help us to make the mind very serviceable. And by that, we will then have completely eliminated laziness. We'll no longer have that factor that is keeping us from fully engaging in the practice of concentration. Forgetting the instruction means to forget the object that we are trying to meditate on. So when we're doing our simple meditation on the breath, forgetting the instruction means you've lost the breath. You're elsewhere. You're making grocery lists in your head, or you're getting distracted by something else going on in the room or whatever. That's where we need mindfulness as the antidote to that. Mindfulness, again, being that non-forgetfulness that stays with what it is that we are wanting to focus on. The third one, non-identification of these two, laxity and excitement. Laxity being the dullness, the heaviness to the mind that keeps the mind very fuzzy in the midst of our meditation, and excitement being the mind that wanders out and gets distracted by especially things that are very pleasurable to us, that are much more interesting and exciting than what we're doing in watching the breath or whatever object we're working on. So introspection is the ability to identify those. Sometimes we find that the mind has been in that state of excitement for quite some time before we identify it. Well, that's why we need introspection, to correct it much sooner so that we aren't wandering miles and miles away, and then we have to pull ourselves back into the moment to be more mindful of the breath or whatever object we're using. The fourth one, non-application of the antidote, means that if those do arise, and even if they're identified, if you don't antidote them, for example, like I said, laxity is this heaviness of the mind. We have to pull the mind up in a sense. We have to heighten our awareness so that we can be back present with the breath. Excitement is the mind that's kind of distracted out. It's energy that's more diffuse. And so we have to bring the mind in back towards the breath or whatever it is that we're meditating on. So we have to apply an antidote that is more specific to what's going on at the time. If we don't apply an antidote, then the mind will continue to be in that wandering state, going wherever it wishes without any real discipline. So it's at that time we need to do the application, actually apply the antidote that is directed towards correcting what's going on in the mind. And then finally, the fifth one is over application of the antidote. We probably won't have that as a problem for some time in our meditation. That means that if we actually do get to this place where the mind is somewhat balanced, where these factors aren't arising, where we're actually in a bit of a calmer state, well, then if we start applying antidotes at that time, they're not necessary. And so they become kind of a problematic mind. So if we're trying to heighten our awareness, but the awareness is perfectly fine, we're on the breath and we're paying attention to it and everything is running along just fine, well, then applying an antidote at that time isn't a good idea. Instead, we have to abide in what's called equanimity. Equanimity in this context isn't the same as the equanimity we often talk about of seeing all beings in an equal regard. Here, it's the idea of maintaining a balance of the mind, continuing to do what you're doing without needing to feel like you have to do anything else, to do any kind of correction or apply any type of antidote. So these are the way that it's traditionally taught. Again, that's just to put the context of mindfulness and introspection into this, where it's taught in regard to how we develop calm abiding in these states of concentration. So again, when we look at these two factors, we see how important they are, especially in meditation. But as I was just saying, and as we saw from that quote from Geshe Yeshe Tupten, these are also needed in terms of our everyday life. And so that's why they're being taught in particular in this chapter, because if we don't have those factors, then it's very hard for us to have control over what we're doing, especially with regard to our ethical behavior. You know, recall that even in the or the middle scope of the Lam Rim, remembering that the Lam Rim, the stages of the path, have 3 levels. Mostly what we're working with in this text is the great level, the level of the person of greatest capacity, the Bodhisattva practitioner who engages in these perfections. So at that level, we've already developed the mind to some degree, but at the second level, the middle scope, it's that at that level that we're taught actually that we need a foundation of good morality in order to develop concentration, in order to develop wisdom, what are called the 3 higher trainings. These 3, morality, concentration, and wisdom, are built one upon each other, and they are all repeated in the paramitas, in the 6 perfections. And so we see the importance of having good control over our behavior. You know, bodhisattvas need that as well. They do it with maybe more elevated motivation. It's not just about, oh, I don't want to suffer from that, or I want to attain my own liberation from that. The idea is that I don't want to harm others. I don't want to do things contrary to the bodhicitta motivation, because we see most of our immoral behavior, our unethical behavior, is behavior where we harm others, where we actually do things to them that are not so good for them, and they're also, of course, not so good for us. But the bodhisattva behavior is wanting to have that awareness that we need to maintain some guard, some alertness around our behavior so that we don't go down that track. We don't do anything that is antithetical to our bodhicitta motivation. So this is the idea behind these two. So let's get into the verses and kind of see where this all goes. So going back to the main outline, we saw that again, there was the general presentation that we just concluded. We now have the individual presentation, which is all of the verses, these 109 verses of this chapter. This has 2 outlines within it. Again, I'm repeating the outlines that are in the Gyaltsab J commentary that you all should have. If you don't have that in front of you, don't worry, it's not a problem. I'll be giving all of the kind of cues as we go through that tonight, as I usually do. So the first of the 2 outlines with regard to the individual presentation is explaining the text of the chapter, and this in turn has 2 outlines. The first outline is explaining extensively how to practice, and this is the bulk of the chapter as well, verses 1 through 107. And this in turn has 3 outlines. The first outline within this explaining extensively how to practice is guarding the mind as a method for guarding the trainings. Again, what I was just saying, that if you don't guard the mind, if you don't have good control over what's going on in the mind, the trainings, the behavior that follows, especially with regard to our ethical behavior, is going to be out of control. We're not going to be able to actually know what we're doing and keep in line what we're doing with our principles, with what it is we're trying to accomplish. So this is the first 22 verses of chapter 5, this idea of guarding the mind as the method for guarding the bodhisattva trainings, the perfections, and so on. So this has 3 outlines within it. So again, we're doing this hierarchical outline thing. We're way down into this next outline, which in turn also has more outlines. The first outline that we have within that idea of guarding the mind as a method for guarding the trainings is protecting all by protecting the mind. In other words, we protect all of what's going on by protecting the mind. If we protect the mind, then that's the main job, and we can then rest assured body, speech, and so on will follow. This has 3 outlines within it, yet one more division. The first of the 3 outlines is showing in brief the necessity of protecting one's mind. So here we finally get into the verses. The very first verse of this text, as Shantideva's do, kind of gives a real solid message as to what the entire chapter pertains to. Those who wish to guard their trainings should very tightly guard their minds. Those who do not guard their minds are unable to guard their trainings. So really emphasizing the importance of the mind as being central in maintaining the bodhisattva behavior with regard to all 6 perfections, but again, especially in this chapter in regard to our ethical behavior. So here we have just a short little commentary from Gyaltsab in regard to this. I'll read that for you. You may have it in front of you. It says, "They who wish to protect the trainings of generosity and the other perfections from degeneration must strongly focus their mind on the trainings and then protect the mind from wandering off to mistaken objects. If one does not protect the mind from wandering off, then it becomes impossible to protect the trainings." So the idea is that if we're going to engage in these six perfections wholeheartedly, then we have to guard our minds and make sure that the mind isn't wandering away, isn't getting distracted, especially by delusions, especially by things that are going to lead us down more unwholesome paths. This is a form of discipline. We use that term sometimes for this second perfection, the perfection of ethical discipline. Well, we need discipline. I know in our culture, discipline seems to be kind of a negative word. But when we talk about self-discipline, especially in the context of the Bodhisattva path, well, it's an absolutely essential part of it. If we aren't able to discipline ourselves to have some control over what's going on in our minds, and by virtue of that, then what happens in our behavior, it's going to be very hard to make some progress on the path. Yeah. Discipline here is a compassionate self-discipline that is very much concerned about our own minds, our own behavior, but is also, of course, compassionate towards others, wanting to make sure that we do what we can to be able to actualize that state of Buddhahood as quickly as possible so we can benefit them. So if we're holding on to the mind of bodhicitta, which we've talked about in the previous chapters, then that can become an impetus for us to have that level of kind of guarding alertness, that desire to stay with our minds, to not let our minds wander, to do what we can to make sure that we follow this path. So let me go back to the slides again, and we'll go on to the next outline. Again, there were three outlines to this first section. The second outline is the fault of degenerating the mind. And there's one verse for that. Kind of, if we let the mind degenerate, then there's going to be faults behind that. We're going to experience some unfortunate consequences. So, Master Shantideva says, "In this world, unsubdued and crazed elephants do not cause such harms as the harms of relentless torment caused by the unleashed elephant of my mind." So, we don't live with elephants around us. We see them in the zoo and they seem maybe perhaps somewhat subdued and tamed. But, and it's said, of course, in India, you do occasionally hear about these things, right, where an elephant goes rampaging through a village and destroys so many things. Well, this is the nature of our minds in that regard. Elephants sort of left on their own and unchecked in that way can do an awful lot of damage. So the analogy here is like saying, well, elephants can do all this damage, but that's nothing. That's like a drop in the bucket compared to the damage that our own minds can do to our experiences, to our ability to benefit others even. We can do great damage to ourselves. And what's pointed out there in that verse is this idea of relenting torment. Relenting torment is said to be the worst of the 8 hot hells. It is the one where it feels like there is absolutely no stop in what experience is there in terms of suffering, no chance to catch your breath, to have any kind of respite from what's going on around you in terms of that hell realm. So in terms of that, those, of course, what our minds are capable of producing, the damage that our minds have done throughout beginningless time in terms of all of the suffering we've experienced. If we don't have this guarding alertness and we let our minds go crazy, they're going to do more damage than what a crazed elephant could do. So in Gyaltsab text, I'm on page 5 here, letting the crazy elephant mind wander off to mistaken objects creates the harm beyond pain of the naraks. The naraks are the hell beings. Again, those beings who are in these states of extreme suffering, according to what the Buddha says, that we've been in that exact same state many, 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 many times. And so we've experienced unbelievable suffering on the basis of our own minds, because the minds are the creator of our actions, and karma is actions of the mind as well as actions of the body and speech that produce results. Those results can be suffering when we have negative states of mind, negative actions that follow from that. So the normal, unsubdued, crazy elephant does not create as much suffering here in this world. Just an ordinary elephant that's crazed and running through a village, you can say it causes an unbelievable amount of damage for the people living there, but that's nothing, again, compared to what our minds have done. So then he Gyaltsab Je tells us, hence one should strive in protecting the mind. So we see that again, mind is really central, as we know from our other Buddhist teachings, that that's really our job, is to be attentive to the mind as much as we can. So the third of these three outlines has the remaining verses 3 through 5 of this small section on protecting all by protecting the mind. This is the benefits of protecting the mind. So we saw the faults of letting the mind degenerate. Now we're going to look at the benefits of protecting the mind. Shantideva says, but if the elephant of my mind is tightly bound through all by the rope of mindfulness, all fears will cease to exist, and all virtues will come into my hand. So again, this is the idea that if we actually are able to control our minds, just like a crazed elephant, and sometimes, again, you might recall in the teachings on how you develop calm abiding, they use an elephant as the mind, and it shows the kind of progressing. I'm sure some of you have seen this. It's like a little diagram with a road that goes winding up, and the elephant is being tamed until you get to the top where you have calm abiding. Well, this is an example of, again, how our own minds need to be tamed by those factors, especially mindfulness and introspection. But as we see, if we really fasten our mind with this rope of mindfulness, just like if you had a strong rope around the neck of an elephant and you could control the elephant in that way, if we control the mind by keeping us mindful of what it is that we're trying to accomplish and do, then all the dangers, are non-existent at that point. They won't occur, and virtues will come about. We'll be able to engage in much more virtuous activity. So Gyaltsab Je says, through tying the crazy elephant mind to the virtuous object, by tying all one's actions of body, speech, and mind comprehensively with the rope of mindfulness, all general dangers of this life become non-existent, and all the virtues of the practices of the three types of beings of the graduated path to enlightenment fall naturally into one's hand. Therefore, one should never let one's mindfulness of the virtuous object degenerate. So again, we all know the three levels of the Lam Rim. I mentioned these earlier. The first level for the person, Rinpoche talks about these being the person of small capacity or small capable being, I think is the term he actually uses. That's the person who is intent upon at least getting a good rebirth out of this life by practicing good attention to one's karma, refraining to engage in the 10 non-virtues and to adopt virtuous behavior, so that when this life ends, there's an assurance that we've got the karma in the bank to take us to the next life and to have good conditions there, to at least have a measure of happiness within samsara, and to also continue to use our lives meaningfully. And then we see the middle scope, the second of the, where we see the bigger picture of what's going on in terms of our cycling life to life. And then we engage in, as I said earlier, the three higher trainings: training in morality, which is rooted in what we just talked about for the small scope, and then the trainings in concentration and wisdom that will help us to enact our own liberation from the cycle of existence, seeing that we're caught up in the state of existence that called samsara that we've been dealing with since beginningless time, the sincere will to move away from that to the state of nirvana. And then finally, the great scope that we're working here, the great capable being, as Rinpoche says, that has the capacity to take on the suffering of the world. It isn't just thinking about me, myself, and I, but rather the benefit to all sentient beings, which includes oneself, which absolutely, makes sure that you attain what is the perfection of your own being in the midst of trying to help all sentient beings to be free from suffering. So all the trainings of those, of course, the six perfections are the main one for the great capable being. All the various trainings and things that we engage in will be accomplished if we have the mindfulness, the rope of mindfulness that keeps the mind fixed on what it is we're trying to accomplish, what it is that we need to do. All these things, will fall naturally into one's hand, as Gyaltsab Je says. We won't have any defeats on the path. We'll just keep moving forward. And when we do have defeats, we'll be able to pick ourselves up and get back on the path very quickly. So he continues with a little bit more extensive explanation of this in these next two verses. He says, tigers, lions, elephants, bears, snakes, and all my enemies, the guardians who are the hell beings, evil spirits, and likewise cannibals, will all be bound by binding this mind alone, and will all be subdued by subduing this mind alone. So this is this idea that, again, we have all these external things. What was mentioned in the first verse of these two tigers, lions, elephants, bears, snakes, all my enemies, it's guardians that appear in the hell realms that are there to torture you, that are a creation of the karma of our own minds and so on. The evil spirits that might exist in this world or other worlds, cannibals, whatever, all these various things, kind of scary, frightening things. All of that will be bound if we bind our mind alone. In other words, all of what we see as an external negative force in our lives, even what we're experiencing now in the world in this COVID-19, this virus, all of that can be subdued, can be bound if we bind our minds, if we actually subdue our own minds. So this is very much rooted once more in this whole idea of karma. Karma is the creator, the force of creation through which we experience all the various things in our world. And I know that it's a difficult concept for a lot of people in the West to adopt and to kind of work with, is to see, to adhere very strongly to the reality of karma. But nonetheless, if we just take it on, as Venerable Rabina often says, she says, we don't have to think, do I believe in karma or not? That's not really the issue. It's that, is it kind of a working hypothesis that I can begin to use in my life? Treat it just like a scientist would in terms of understanding something that's going on in the world. Use it as a hypothesis and start living your life in that way. And I think it's a really wonderful way to take it, is because the reality is that I can't prove to you that karma exists. Lama Zopa Rinpoche, as holy of a being as he is, he can't prove to you that karma exists. His Holiness the Dalai Lama, again, wonderful teacher, but he can't prove to you that karma exists. What we have to do is begin to develop our own conviction from living our lives that way, from being very attentive and mindful of what it is that we're doing, and to recognize that we are the creators of our own experience. Even when we get to something, again, that's going on in this world, it's not that I'm saying that you can change what's happening in the outside world by virtue of thinking about it differently, but we do see that even that moment when we have different thoughts about what's happening, we are able to reduce to some degree the suffering that we're experiencing through fear, anxiety, stress, and so on, and looking at the world around us right now. And we have great control over our own minds. Our happiness in the end comes from our own minds, and our suffering comes from our own minds. So if we're attentive to that idea and start living our lives with that as our working hypothesis, we will see over time, as many practitioners have, that it does make a difference, that we actually are able to change how we experience the world. And eventually, over time, we transform the entire thing. As I mentioned when we did the mandala offering at the beginning of the teaching tonight, that pure realm that we're visualizing is your sort of future Buddha realm. You can completely purify your experience to where you don't have any defects or faults that you're experiencing at all. Of course, you see the countless other beings who are still together with all of that, and you're motivated and moved to then, benefit them as best as you can. That's the ultimate kind of production of a result from practicing the law of cause and effect, karma, is by being attentive to that, we actually create the greatest possible result that we can have. And then we help others to create that as well. Everything that is produced falls according to the laws of karma in terms of cause and result. In terms of the experiences that we have, that others have, it's all a product of our own minds. This is a very central teaching that's going to come in terms of this section of the text of chapter 5, is because we're dealing with morality. And again, the whole concept of Buddhist morality is not that the Buddha is up on high, like, God sending down the 10 commandments to Moses, and he brings them down and says, here's the word of God in terms of how you have to live your life. And as Venerable Rabina says, if that's your understanding of where morality is formulated, then it makes sense to say, I will abide by what God has said in terms of how I need to live my life, because your faith in God leads you to want to follow the rules that God has set out. But the Buddha didn't lay this down. The Buddha didn't come down from on high and say, these are the 10 non-virtues and you have to avoid all of these. He gave that advice, but that's not because the Buddha says to do it. He's pointing out that you're the creator of your own negative experiences by virtue of engaging in those. So karma is a really fundamental principle in understanding what Buddhist morality is based on. It's not based on, again, the Buddha himself being a punisher, somebody who's going to put us down and cause us to suffer because we haven't lived up to what the Buddha said we should. It's just giving us the advice, the information, so that we then can make a decision. And here in this context of this text, the idea is that if we have that mindfulness that has heard those teachings and that knows what we want to adopt, what we want to abandon, well, then we have the force through which we can actually practice that way. And especially practice all of the perfections, all of the bodhisattva deeds, so that we can eventually achieve the result that will come from all of these causes. The paramitas, again, they're called perfections because they are the causes that lead to the perfection of in the state of Buddhahood. So if we practice the six perfections within this context of maintaining mindfulness, introspection, especially the practice of our morality, that second perfection, then we will get good results from that. It's a simple equation. And as I point out when I talk about karma, and you probably have heard this from me, some of you before, but we have great faith in the law of cause and effect in the physical world around us. And certainly when we look at what's going on with this virus, we know that there are certain causes and conditions that have led to this being here, and we can see what needs to be done in terms of interrupting the causes and conditions for individuals to not get to acquire this virus and to get sick from it and so on. We see that there is a law of cause and effect that is taking place. If it wasn't taking place in the physical world to the degree that it is, we wouldn't have much confidence in our physical world at all, because people would get the virus without even having left their home. People would have, be around people with it and not get it at all. I mean, you'd have a lot of strange things going on that would be occurring. But we know that there's cause and effect in the world. We know that we get vegetables when we plant vegetable seeds in our garden and we tend to them and they get enough sun and water and eventually the vegetables come. We have great confidence in the physical world and how things manifest in terms of cause and effect. The law of cause and effect here is just an extension of that, and it's with regard to the experiences of beings. And it's not meant to be something to lay a heavy guilt trip on you by thinking, oh my God, this is what's going on in my life and in my world. I must have been a really horrible person. I feel really bad about myself that I created such problems and difficulties. No, I mean, pay attention to it, take some responsibility for it, but recognize that the whole gist of karma is to give us what we need to work on, to help us to learn from what's happening in the world around us and in our own lives, and then to make changes so we continue to go in the right direction. So again, that's just another context for looking at what we're talking about here in terms of karma, that these verses in particular spelling out that if we subdue our minds, if we actually are able to be attentive to what's going on, all those things, the tigers and lions and snakes and bears and whatever, elephants, all these other enemies, everything that's produced in any realm of suffering in samsara, all of these things we experience, viruses, everything is a product of our own minds. And if we subdue our minds, we subdue those factors. So the second outline that was within this, again, we just went through the first one, which was let's see, protecting all by protecting the mind. And so now we're going into the reason for this. So the first 5 verses, Master Shantideva was saying, if you protect your mind, then you protect, your behavior and your results you get from it and so on. Well, now he's looking at the reason for this, giving us an extensive exploration of kind of why this is so. And we're going to first look at, within the 2 outlines within this, the idea that all of the faults that we engage in depend upon the mind, that's where they're started, that's where they're created. And there are just 3 verses for this. The very first one, verse 6, says, "The perfect speech itself indicated, thus all fears as well as all boundless suffering originate from the mind." So this is the idea that, again, the able one, the Buddha, in his perfect speech, indicated that, as it says in the Gyaltsabje's commentary, one's experiences of dangers and sufferings are created by one's own mind. The reason is that all dangers and the boundless suffering of this life and future lives arise from one's own negative mind. So again, he's emphasizing this idea of the sufferings and the things that we have to experience that are negative, because that's the impetus to once more practice good morality, is to recognize that we will suffer from as the consequences of our negative actions. And moreover, we will be blocked from helping others if we are in suffering states. So if we're intent upon this bodhisattva motivation, it doesn't make sense for us to engage in unskillful behavior, because that unskillful behavior will lead to suffering results. Those suffering results will become an obstacle for us being able to benefit others. to develop our path and, continue to practice the Bodhisattva deeds and so on. So there are even more quotes. This whole section is after chapter 6 is all these quotes from Sutra and that. There's a quote from the Sutra of Clouds of Jewels. If one controls one's mind, one controls all phenomena. So this is once more the idea that everything that we experience is a product of our own minds. If we control our own minds, we are in effect controlling the phenomena that we experience, the world around us. Again, seeing that even one of the results that we see of our karma is that we create an environmental result. The very environment that we live in is a product of our actions. So we are able to purify all of that if we are quite attentive to our minds. The Buddha also said, and I guess it's in that same sutra, whether it is virtue or non-virtue, it is accumulated by the mind. And this is once more the idea that although we do have actions we do physically or verbally, we are creating karma primarily through our minds. It's worse when it becomes verbal or physical. If we just have harmful thoughts in our head, that's bad enough. But if those harmful thoughts result in us saying harsh speech to another person, or perhaps stealing from them or doing something to injure their bodies and so on, well, then we have made that manifest in another way. But the mind is still together behind that. And this is seen in the law of cause and effect in karma when we see that if we engage in something unintentionally, like say you're walking on the street and you can't possibly keep an eye on all the little critters that are on the sidewalk or what have you, and you happen to step on an ant at that time without knowing, with no intention, well then the karma that is created, it is an action, but it's not very definite at all in terms of any sorts of results you'll gain from it because the mind wasn't present. Whereas if that ant is crawling on your counter in your kitchen and you go, oh, those damn ants, and you smash it, with some intention, then you create a very powerful karma because your mind moved you in that direction to where you did something physical in order to take the life of that being. So once more, this idea in this one, whether it's virtue or non-virtue, it's accumulated by the mind, especially all of our virtuous behavior is coming from our minds. Acts of generosity that we see in the first perfection, acts of kindness towards others, acts of refraining from killing and so on. All of this comes about through our intention, through our minds, and it can manifest in other forms, but the mind is the forerunner of all of that. Then another quote, the mind, it precedes all phenomena. If one knows the mind well, one knows all phenomena well. Again, similar thoughts. And then finally, from the perfect compendium of phenomena, all phenomena depend on the mind. So this once more is this idea that the mind is central in Buddhism. Mind, again, being that component of our being that is clear and knowing. Its nature is clarity. It is pure. It is a non-material phenomenon. It's not something that is we can identify, that we can kind of look at and grasp at mind. It doesn't have any color or shape or anything like that. And then we have the function of mind, which is to know. It is in the nature of mere experience. Mind is with us all the time, even when we're sleeping and in subtler states, the mind is still there, moment by moment arising, even though we don't have a strong consciousness of that arising of mind in those states. Mind will continue. It has never had a beginning. It goes back without any beginning, and it goes forward without any end. So mind is really central again in Buddhism, and that's why, once more, we're calling this course Mastering the Mind, because it really does deal with some of the things we need, factors within our own minds that will help us to proceed on the Bodhisattva path. Conscientiousness in chapter 4, which once more is that intention to abide in a more virtuous track. It's a strong motivating force that kind of moves us to continue to do what we do. Again, it's akin to conscience as we talk about it in the West, a voice within ourselves that keeps us on the straight and narrow. But then we have the mindfulness here that we're talking about that keeps the mind in place once we've made that determination to move in that direction. And then the introspection that keeps us from diverting away from that. So this was this first of these verses in this section that deals with the whole idea of how we need to work with the mind, that our faults depend upon the mind, therefore we have to be attentive to it. So we see then in verse 7 and 8, we're going to look at these two together. A question is raised, who intentionally created the weapons of hell beings? Who created the burning iron ground? From what did all those hosts of women ensue? I'll explain this in a moment. It's just referring to a particular hell realm where there is this experience for men to have an appearance of women that can be deceitful to them, and it would be vice versa for women to have an appearance of men. But the Muni taught that all such things are the negative mind. Hence, within the three worlds, and here by three worlds we mean the realm of desire realm that we are in the human realm, that's a part of the desire realm, the realm of form, the realm that is formless. Those three realms that the Buddha said exist. Within these three worlds, there is nothing to fear other than my own mind. My own mind is the main factor that is creating, again, these various things that were talked about, the weapons of the hell beings that were being tortured with in those states, the burning iron ground upon which the bodies are stretched and cut up and so on, these various realms of hell. The hosts of women here, this is referring to, again, this there's what's called the Shalmali tree. The Shalmali tree is this tree that has these iron kind of leaves. The leaves sort of look like they're sharp, kind of like the edges of swords, and they're all pointing downward when you're at the bottom of the tree. And again, if it's a man who's at the bottom of the tree in a male form in the hell realm, well, they start hearing the voices of the women that they were attached to in a prior life or something. Again, I guess this is assuming a heterosexual male. I don't know if there's variations in terms of same sex and what have you. I've never heard a Tibetan teacher talk about that, but a man would be enticed by the callings of these women that induce some sexual desire, something, to kind of climb up the tree towards. And it can even be, again, someone who was very close to in a prior life. And so they start climbing up this tree, and all of these sharp leaves, these Shalmali tree leaves that are pointing down towards them, cut up their bodies as they go up the tree. They get to the top of the tree, and the person that they thought was up there who was enticing them isn't there. They're down on the ground now, and they're enticing them again to go back down. And then the leaves all turn upwards and they go down, and the same process happens. And then they go back up and they go back down until that karma is exhausted. So that's what that verse is talking about. Again, it's not meant to be anything derogatory towards women. Master Shantideva was teaching to an audience of monks, and so he was using the idea of men being attracted to women because that was in that culture, and what was going on would be something that these monks all knew and could relate to. So that's what he's referring to in that line. So all of these things we talked about, the weapons of these hell beings, the burning iron ground there, these women who are enticing the men to climb up the Shalmali tree. Buddha taught that all these things are the negative mind. They're the product of the negative mind. The negative mind having been the cause that induces this result. So within the three worlds, there's nothing to fear other than my own mind. All these things that we talked about, they are products of our own mind. So the fear shouldn't be directed at those, because if there's something sort of solidly external, they are a product of our own karma, a product of our own creation. So I'm just going to read a little bit in regard to what Gyaltsep J says. I've skipped over one of these in relation to the verses 4 and 5, but he gets into some opponents and things, and I don't know that we need to go there in talking about this, but he says, if the sufferings that are experienced by suffering beings in the hells and elsewhere do not arise from the person's own preceding negative mind, then who forged purposefully the weapons of the hell guardians, these swords, spears, and so on? These were not made purposefully by a creator God, nor were they made purposefully by someone else. Who created the burning iron ground? Who created the host of females that cause one to climb and fall off? He uses this idea of the crystal mountain. I don't think it's quite the same thing. Most of the commentaries say the Shalmali trees are what's being referred to here. There is no other cause or creator. Of course, this is where Buddhism varies greatly from all of the theistic traditions that say that there is a God that created all of the realms of existence and created the beings in it, and is the master mind behind all of what we experience, which of course is one way of looking at cause and effect, and saying that the cause of it is the mind of this omnipotent, omniscient being, and the effect is the world that we experience and the beings in it. In Buddhism, there's no subscription to that idea. In Buddhism, we say that if we pose those questions, well, if it's not our negative mind, who is the creator of that? There can be no other creator. The creator is our own negative mind. We cannot find anything that is this creator God. Now, I'm not trying to get it, I wouldn't want to diminish anyone's faith who believed in a creator God. In Buddhism, it's simply not needed. Why? Because we're the creators of our own experience. We're the creators of our own world. The laws of karma are set out in terms of all the various results that we experience. And as I said, included in that is even the environment that we experience, that we are born into, that we live our lives in. All of this being a product. And we're not, again, denying the cause and effect that happens in a conventional way, like what's going on in the world in terms of climate change. This is a karmic creation, but yes, it's also something we can identify in terms of what's happened with carbon dioxide being released and so on, all the various factors that have contributed to it. So we're not denying the cause and effect that's happening in the physical world, but we can certainly see that part of that are the delusions of beings that have led us all to create a world that is being endangered in this way. And of course, when we see it through the karmic lens, we can't possibly know all the causes and conditions that have led to us living now in a world that is damaged in this way and that looks like it's going to continue to move in an unfavorable direction. So all of this is the creation of our minds. The person posing these questions is simply, hypothetically saying, well, if it's not caused by the negative mind, what could it be caused by? In the end, as it was said in that verse, it is just the negative mind that is the creator of all of that. That's why the mind is the most dangerous thing, but it also, of course, has the most potential within it to create something that is totally opposed to all of that. So one more little paragraph from this, it says, since it is also incorrect to say that they are generated without cause, the able one, the Buddha, taught in the close placement with Mindfulness Sutra and others that they are generated from one's own negative mind. It's also not proper to say that these things arise with no cause. If we said that all the experiences of beings in this world that are suffering, that are happiness, whatever, there's no cause to them, it's causeless. Well, in a sense, that's kind of saying that things are random, that they arise for no reason at all, with no precedent in terms of the energy that was created that have led to the subsequent results that we experience. And that would mean that everything it's a crapshoot. Whatever happens is whatever happens. So that's not very empowering. That's why I like the teachings on karma, because they essentially say, I'm in the driver's seat. I'm in the driver's seat making decisions about where I go and what I experience. And therefore, I'm quite empowered then to create the experiences that I want to and to avoid those that I don't want to. Makes it very clear in terms of personal empowerment through taking responsibility then. So again, the rest of this just talks about different opponents that might put forward, opposing views. There is a summary to this. It essentially says, since all faults arise from the mind, all three realms are created by one's mind. There is no threat apart from this. There is no danger apart from what our minds are doing. Everything that we consider to be the outside enemy, is only a product of our internal enemy, our own delusions that have induced us to create the karma so that we experience those things. But we looked at the faults that depend on the mind. That was the first part of this. Now we're going to look at the qualities. So let me just introduce this topic and maybe do a little bit, and then I want to check in and see if there are any questions before we get to the end of tonight. There are 6 outlines for the qualities depending on the mind. Again, this is pertaining to the 6 perfections. We're going to look at how each of the perfections, which qualities we want to generate, depend on the mind, that it is a mental creation. Remember, I pointed this out earlier when I had the slide up in regard to the 6 perfections and how we describe them. Their intentions, their states of mind, their knowers, they're a creation of our own minds. They do manifest in other behavior, physical behavior. For example, the first one, generosity, does manifest in our sharing of our material resources and so on with other beings. So this first outline, generosity depends on the mind. There are 2 verses for this. Verse 9 is kind of setting out that when we talk about the perfection of that generosity, it doesn't entail perfecting the external world, because it's perfecting the internal world that we're talking about. So verse 9 says, if the perfection of generosity were the alleviation of migrating beings' poverty, Then, since there are still starving migrating beings, in what manner did the previous protectors perfect it? So this is this idea again that if we look at it from the outside and say, well, okay, what does it mean to perfect generosity? Well, then for an individual to perfect generosity means that all of the material generosity has to be complete, and that there is no longer any being that it needs to be the recipient of that. We will have put food in the mouths of all beings. We will have put money in the banks of all beings. We will have done everything that we can to alleviate the suffering of others by giving them what will do that. Well, the question would be raised then, in what manner did the previous Buddhas perfect it then? Because we still have poverty with us now. So on your handout, actually, again, which is also something that you may have printed earlier, whoops, uh, and it is available again through the coordinators of this course. If the completion of the perfection of generosity were the perfection of generosity through the alleviation of all migrating beings' poverty, then, since there are still starving migrating beings, in what manner did the previous protector Buddhas perfect the perfection of generosity? It would follow that they did not complete it. The evidence is there. Again, this is taken from a text that's another commentary. We were using Sipjays as the main one, but when I taught this previously, Ziggy had also done a translation of Abbot Dragpa Gyaltsen's text, which is the titles there at the bottom of the screen. This is another commentary, and because when I was teaching this previously, people didn't have a commentary in front of them. They didn't have Gyaltsip Jays, and I was reluctant to give them the full commentary from Abbot Dragpa Gyaltsen's because it was quite extensive. So anyway, I occasionally took passages from that and put it into the handout. So you do have the handout as well, and these are just verses or commentary from that. So the idea here again is that they couldn't have completed the perfection of generosity if there's still poverty, if the measure was what's going on externally. But as it says in verse 10 then, the perfection of generosity is taught to be the mind intending to give all things, as well as its result to all beings. Hence, it is simply the mind. So how do we mean that bodhisattvas perfect generosity? We don't mean that they alleviate all the needs of all beings through their generosity so that beings don't ever have any needs. Instead, they perfect their own minds, their intention to give away all things. There's nothing that the bodhisattva wouldn't give, as well as the result, the merit from that, to all beings. This mind that is never wanting to hold on to anything, but always being willing to give it away. The willingness to give, the intention to give, is in the very nature of the perfection of generosity. Hence, it is simply the mind. So again, whoops, Abbot Dr. Gyaltsen says, thus, its completion is taught to be the perfection of generosity by way of the mind that wishes to give all bodies, resources, roots of virtue, and things, as well as all the merit, the result of giving to all beings. Hence, generosity is simply contingent on the mind. So this is the idea that we're going to look at in regard to all six of the perfections, is that you could look at it and say, well, where's the measure of having perfected that? And the measure always has to do with what we have done with our minds. They say that the bodhisattva who's engaged in what's called the surpassing perfection of generosity, which happens on the first ground, after that bodhisattva attains their initial direct realization of emptiness, they have developed a perfection of generosity that it surpasses anything that they've practiced prior to that. In that, they can even give up their own bodies to another being without any regret, without any remorse whatsoever. Of course, there's the wonderful story of when Buddha Shakyamuni was a prince, and he and his brothers were out and they came across a starving tigress. There had been a drought in the land, and this tigress had just given birth to 5 cubs and was in danger of losing her own life, or perhaps even eating her own cubs to sustain her life. And the Buddha, in his great compassion, decided he would offer his body. And of course, he was a bodhisattva in training at this time, but he was training till he got to that place where he recognized that there was no problem in giving his body, that it was actually the best possible thing for him to do. He had reached that apex of his own willingness to give, that he was able to do that. And of course, the story is that he then, sliced into his own neck so the tigress could begin to eat at him and sustain her strength, and then eventually devour his body and feed the cubs, and they all survived. It's said that the 5 cubs actually became the 5 disciples that the Buddha practiced with initially, and that came to Deer Park to hear the very first teaching he gave. They were those same mental continuums manifesting in the form of these 5. So very strong karma he created by that type of generosity. But once more, most of us aren't at that level, right? We're not willing to even give, a kidney to somebody if they need it, or some other thing, an organ that we have that they might desire, much less even blood or something like that. Some people even have a resistance to giving in that way. So we see that we're not at the level yet that these bodhisattvas are at. But that's the perfection of it, is so that they have a mind that is so willing to give that when the call comes for that to happen, there's no hesitation. In fact, there's great delight at giving in that context. So this is what we mean by practicing the perfection of generosity. We don't mean that you're going to somehow have all the beings out there completely with everything that they desire. We mean that we're going to be in the best possible state to benefit them, because when they do have needs, we have the willingness to give. We're not holding back and being miserly on anything. So let's check in. It's like 15 minutes before the end, and I do want to give some time if people have any questions or comments. I don't see anything in the chat box. You're certainly welcome to throw questions in there at any time, or comments, and I can share them. If you'd like to ask a question, again, you can unmute your mic and do that, and I'm happy to take any questions or comments. Okay. Well, let's go into the text then and continue this exploration of this idea that it's perfecting the mind, developing the mind, that is the way that we generate these 6 perfections. So, I forgot to change it to second. It should say second outline instead of first outline at the bottom there. Morality depends on the mind. This is the second of the 6 outlines, the second of the 6 perfections. There's only one verse for this, verse 11. It says, it poses a question here, well, where will the fish and so forth be driven so that they will not be killed? Hence, the attainment of the intention of abandonment is explained to be the perfection of ethics. Ethics is generally defined as the abandonment of the intention to harm. And of course, the acts of harm that would be motivated by that. So the question is put forward in the first 2 lines. Well, there are fish that are killed, there are chickens that are killed in our world, and cows and pigs, and so many beings that are killed by others, deer and so on. Where would you possibly find a reservation big enough that you could put all of those beings and protect them from being killed? This is just not possible. So once more, we're not perfecting morality by assuring that no being is harmed, but rather that we have abandoned the intention to harm them. That's the perfection of ethics. So the completion of the perfection of ethics, Abbot Drukpa Gyaltsen says, does not need to depend on the exhaustion of sentient beings who are objects of killing. Who is able to drive all those deer and so forth to some other place? They will not be killed. No one is able to such a place. We can't imagine that happening, in this world, to have like a whole continent that would be where all of the beings live, that they could be protected from any humans killing them, any other beings killing them, because animals kill other animals too. We know that happens. It's just not possible. Hence, the attainment of perfect familiarization with the intention to abandon the thought of harming, the thought of stealing, and so forth, is explained to be completion of the perfection of ethics. If we have abandoned that thought within our own minds, then we have accomplished the perfection of morality, of ethical behavior. Again, I forgot to change it on this one too. I was doing these earlier today, and it just kind of was an oversight on my part. I apologize. This is the 3rd outline. Patience depends on the mind. There are 3 verses for this. This is some of the best known verses in this text, one of them in particular, verse 13. It starts off in verse 12 saying that unruly sentient beings are like space. All of them cannot possibly be overcome. But if I overcome the mind of anger alone, this will be equivalent to vanquishing all those foes. So we can find certainly that there are difficult people anywhere you go. How can you possibly overcome all those unruly sentient beings, get them all subdued so that you then have a happy life because there are no more annoying beings in the world. We've gotten rid of them all. You know, that's not the point. If I overcome the mind of anger itself in my own minds, that's equivalent to getting rid of all those foes. Again, the enemy of anger in our own minds is what makes other beings into enemies for on the outside. Getting rid of all those outside enemies isn't the solution. Getting rid of anger in our own minds is the solution. So here, Abbot Dorkpa Gyaltsen says, furthermore, if I overcome the mind of anger alone, this will be equivalent to vanquishing all those external foes. However, this does not need to depend on exterminating the observed objects of anger in that, because unruly sentient beings are as infinite as space, all of them cannot possibly be overcome in that external way, right? Hence, patience, it also is contingent upon the mind. This third perfection we perfect in our own minds. It's not by eliminating all of the objects of anger that exist in the world, all those beings who could annoy us and irritate us. So this is the verse that you may have heard of before. Master Shantideva uses a wonderful example. Where could I possibly find enough leather with which to cover the surface of the earth? Having leather on just the soles of my shoes is equivalent to covering the earth with it. So this is this, like I said, a really beautiful analogy for the world that we live in terms of annoying things. It's just like where I live here in New Mexico, I would never even think about going out walking around barefoot. In Florida, where some of you are, you'd love to go barefoot on the beach. Hopefully no one's left any, broken glass bottles or anything anywhere. But here in New Mexico, the ground is pretty rough in places. It's a lot of sharp stuff, a lot of really difficult stuff. You wouldn't even think about going out there barefoot. So you might have this idea, this concept, well, maybe I could, smooth out the whole world so that I never have to step on anything that's sharp. Maybe in modern times it wouldn't be leather. Maybe we might think it's like asphalting the entire earth, paving over the entire earth so that everything is wonderful to the touch. We don't have to worry about ever getting pierced by another sharp object again. Well, where would you find enough asphalt, even much less leather, to do that? It's kind of an absurd thought to think that you're going to do that and pave over the entire world so that you can go wherever you want. Doesn't it make more sense to put something that is solid underneath your feet, whether it be leather, or now we have, of course, a lot of other substances that people use for shoes, the bottom of their shoes. If I have that underneath my feet, then my feet will never face any sort of problems. Nothing's going to pierce through it because I've protected my feet. I've protected myself. A similar concept here is I protect my mind, then no matter who I meet, whatever they are doing, I don't have to worry about having this negative interaction and being harmed by them because I've protected my mind. Anger isn't going to arise. So this is what Master Shantideva goes through in terms of the next verse. But first, let's look at the commentary from the Abbot Dorkpa Gyaltsen. He says, for example, where could I possibly find enough leather with which to cover the surface of the earth for the preventing my feet from being by thorns and so forth? Therefore, in order not to be harmed by thorns and the like, covering my feet with leather on just the soles of my shoes is equivalent to covering the entire surface of the earth. Once we've covered our own feet, go wherever we like. We're not going to have the danger of being pierced by those sharp objects. So in verse 14, the last of these three that have to do with patience, he says, likewise, it is not possible for me to counteract things externally. But should I counteract this mind of mine, the mind of anger again, what is the need for counteracting others? If I tame my own anger so that I'm only patient, I have an undisturbed mind wherever I go, well, then I've done the job. I don't need to get rid of all the annoying people in the world. All I need to do is get rid of my own mind of anger that is annoyed by them, that has the reaction of wanting to say harsh things to them or do things that harm them. Okay. So Abbot Dorkpa Gyaltsen, his commentary on that, he says, just as in the example of the leather and so on, it is not possible for me to externally counteract harmful things outside, but should this mind of mine observe those objects and counteract the arising of anger, due to familiarization with that, patience will be completed. Over time, by continually being in a mind of patience, I will eventually overcome that. Then what will be the need for me to externally counteract other objects of anger? I will not be able to counteract them, and there will be no need to do so. So, this is this whole idea that if we get rid of the anger that is the enemy inside, then we don't have the enemy outside. Those beings will come into our lives, they'll say and do things that would normally annoy us and cause us to be triggered, but we don't, because we are in a mind of patience. If we perfected that mind on the inside, it doesn't matter what happens on the outside. We don't have to put leather over the entire world. We don't have to quiet every single being who is annoying and irritating and difficult. All we do is we quiet our own minds. We develop that undisturbed quality that we can become familiar with over time. In fact, I am teaching currently a little course for the Taoist group here in New Mexico. And of course, I've been doing that online called Finding Calm in the Storm, where I go through different techniques of working with anger. And I'll just let you know that you can join that. You're welcome to join that through, the link is at TNL's website, because we did post it there. It may be at City Garba's website, but if you go to TNL, like Tupten Norbuling, those initials, TNLSF, which is Santa Fe, .org, tnlsf.org, and the very homepage that you see on the one side, there will be a list of all the things that we're offering here, and there are many other events that we're offering here that are online right now that will continue at least to the end of April. So know that if you'd like to join that course and hear more about working with patience, we will be getting to the patience chapter next after we finish 4 and 5. So you can also wait for that, but I thought I'd at least let you know about that. Got about 5 minutes. Let's see if we can get at least another perfection or two done. Again, fourth outline, I apologize for that as well. Enthusiasm depends on the mind. There's only one verse for this. Enthusiasm or joyous effort is this fourth perfection. Master Shantideva says, although the result of generating a clear mind is Brahma and so forth, the results along with body and speech will be weak in conduct. Therefore, it is not like that. It's a kind of cryptic verse. What it's talking about is that if we put our attention into generating any of the deeper states of concentration, especially what is called the first concentration, that does cause a rebirth. If you pursue that karma, it allows you to be reborn in the realm of these gods, the Brahma realms and so on, these form realm beings that are a product of that. So if you have kind of that clear mind that is generated with great enthusiasm, and you engage in your practices to develop that concentration, if you don't put the energy into it, you're going to have those results not ensue. So we see that having joyous enthusiasm, a perseverance in our practice is really important, even for these more mundane results of getting a rebirth in one of these realms through the force of this type of concentration. Again, that's a rather detailed explanation of these concentrations. Let's look at what Abbot Dork Belson says. The fulfillment of familiarization with joyous effort is also contingent upon the mind, because although the result of slightly generating a clear mind, enthusiastic about cultivating the meditative absorption of the first concentration and the like, which is included within meditative absorption, is rebirth in the abodes of Brahma and so forth. As I explained, if you familiarize yourself with that mind of the first concentration, you can be reborn in that realm. If the mind is not associated with power, with this enthusiasm, gives it great power, the results of the mind, along with the body and speech, will be weak in energy and inferior in conduct, whereby one will not be able to be thus reborn in the first concentration and so forth. So you can, if you don't have that great enthusiasm for your practice and put energy into it, you're not going to get the results that you seek, even in with, again, this mundane desire to be reborn in one of these form realms, which is not any great shakes. I mean, it's a place of a lot less suffering, but it doesn't lead you necessarily to liberation or enlightenment unless you practice all the other things of the path. But nonetheless, it's using that as an example that if we don't have that enthusiasm, we won't even get that rebirth in one of these form realms. Thus, the fulfillment of familiarization with joyous effort is contingent upon a powerful mind. The fifth outline, mental stabilization, depends on the mind. Concentration is also a name for this sometimes. The knower of reality, this is the Buddha, taught that even if recitation and hardships are practiced for long periods of time, they will be meaningless if the mind is distracted elsewhere. So again, we're talking here about the concentration that is necessary to generate great realizations. If we don't actually have that dedicated, concentrated, focused mind, no matter what we engage in, recitations, hardships, and so on, even if we do them for a very long period of time, they're not going to produce the result if we have a mind that's always distracted elsewhere. You know, if we're sitting there and reciting our mantras and doing prostrations, but the mind is thinking about other things, well, then there's not much force to that practice. So Abbot Dr. Gyaltsen says the completion of perfection of concentration is also contingent on the mind that is free from laxity and excitement. Again, those two forces that we talked about earlier, and is conjoined with mental attention that is clear and weary, because the knower of reality, the Buddha, taught that even if the recitation of Dharani mantras and hardships such as abiding and fasting are practiced for long periods of time, oops, it's not going. Okay, there. If the mind is distracted elsewhere, they will be meaningless since they will not yield the desired result. So if we have a mind that's distracted, no matter what we do in terms of our actions, we're going to have a problem. Since we're just right at the end of this with the sixth outline, wisdom depends on the mind, the last of the six perfections. Let me go through this because it's rather quick, and we'll maybe just review these briefly at the beginning of next week. Even those who wish to obtain happiness and overcome suffering will wander with no aim if they do not comprehend the secret of the mind, that is emptiness, selflessness, the principal dharma. So once more, even if we strongly desire to attain states of happiness and to be free from suffering, we're going to keep wandering purposelessly in samsara if we don't ever get the wisdom that is the knowing the nature of reality, knowing emptiness. So the final slide here for tonight, Abbot Dorpa Gitson says, wisdom is also contingent upon the mind, because those who wish to obtain unsurpassed happiness and overcome the sufferings of psychic existence will wander blithely without any aim wishing for them if they do not comprehend this truth of the ultimate secret of the mind, since no person teaches the principal dharma or the supreme meaning to inappropriate vessels. So kind of like we do have to have our mind intent upon achieving the wisdom of emptiness and do all of the practices and engage in the teachings that will help us to have that deeper realization. Otherwise, we're going to keep going from life to life, experiencing all the various things in psychic existence, kind of casually going from life to life without any real aim, you know, that wishes for the results that we actually seek, because we haven't put the energy into the wisdom that will help us to attain them. So this is this idea again that all six of these perfections are dependent upon working with your mind. And that's why, again, in this whole chapter, we're talking about guarding the mind, making sure that our minds stay in the proper place so that we can support our development of the trainings. Without guarding the mind, the trainings aren't guarded, as we saw in the very first verse of this chapter. And if we do guard the mind, then the trainings will be guarded. So again, this is just, we're in this beginning part of this chapter. We're going to get into more detailed teachings and also even look at the three categories of the practice of morality, the perfection of morality, that give us better guidelines about how we need to use those tools of mindfulness and introspection to assure that we are moving in the right direction with regard to that practice. So it's just after 7. I apologize for keeping you just a couple minutes later, and that's because I really did want to go ahead and get through those 6, and I hope you're okay with that. Let me put on the screen the prayers. If you do have any questions, maybe write them down, and we can open up to questions at the beginning of next session next week. Keep in mind, there is a session next week. Initially, I wasn't planning to be here. I was going to be at the Buddhism teaching, but they are not allowing anyone to come in, obviously, with what's going on. I want to take the chance that the virus makes its way into that confined space of a prison. So I will be here and be happy to do another teaching next Monday, same time. Let's now dedicate all of these virtuous actions we've engaged in through having this mind of bodhicitta and listen to these teachings, develop some understanding in our own thoughts and what have you. May this become the cause for ourselves to become a Buddha and then be the guru for all beings, leading all of them into that same state of Buddhahood. Let's recite that verse with that thought. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. And then again, as we saw in the very first few chapters of this text, bodhicitta is so rare and so precious. Make this strong thought, dedicating that what we've done tonight become the cause to help bodhicitta to grow and develop in our own hearts and in the hearts of all beings. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more. And then we make prayers for our precious teacher, recognizing that we really need these guides in our lives, especially as we see what's going on in our world. Recognize the value, the benefit of having these beings here. So strong prayers, beings continue to have good health and long lives, and so that we and others always have perfect guides in all our lifetimes. The wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech. May all your holies be spontaneously fulfilled. Then for Zopa, you who uphold the suburb as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjunath's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplish magnificent prayers honoring the three jewels, Savior of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. And then finally, make dedications in your heart right now for all those beings whose situation moves you. We can think in very general ways about the beings in this world, especially in some of these, centers, epicenters of what's going on in terms of this epidemic, and making strong prayers for the well-being of all those who are succumbing to the virus, all those who have died, all of those who are tending to them, all the first responders and people who are dedicating their lives to helping others in the midst of this epidemic. We can think about others that we're holding in our hearts right now, those who are experiencing obstacles or illness, who have died or who are dying at this time, and make strong dedications for these beings to have an immediate relief of their suffering, and for them to achieve everything that will bring them perfect causes for complete Buddhahood, to progress on that path and to quickly be removed from the state of suffering and attain that perfection of Buddhahood. And may all beings attain the state of complete perfection of Buddhahood through what we've done here tonight. Okay, thank you all so much. I really enjoyed tonight's class and being with all of you. And again, please stay safe.
Bye.
You're welcome. Thank you, Samati.
Thank you.
And yes, be very careful. Take care of yourself and your loved ones, and stay healthy, please. Okay.
You too.